Good morning, all. Today's first topic is influenza. In the introduction, influenza is most commonly called as the flu. Everybody will be knowing it by the name of flu. It is an illness caused by RNA viruses belonging to the Orthomyxoviridae family. Okay, it is an acute systemic viral infection that primarily affects the respiratory tracts, and mortality rate is quite high, and it is mostly high in elder extremes of age groups, either the elderly above the age group of 50 or in the young infants. Okay, and and in pregnant women, and as well as immunocompromised conditions. Okay, in these cases mortality rate is quite high, and there are 4 types: influenza A, B, C, and D. Whereas in these 4 types, influenza A virus is further classified into subtypes. This classification is done based upon the glycoproteins that are present, that is hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. Okay, and variations in depending upon the variations in this, it is classified into subtypes, depending upon what? 2 glycoproteins, hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. Okay, currently circulating in humans are subtype A, H1N1, and A, H3N2, which are most commonly seen. Only influenza type A viruses are the most common causes for pandemics. Influenza type B viruses, it cannot be classified into subtypes, but it can be broken down into 2 broad lineages: B Yamagata or B Victoria lineage. Okay. Influenza C viruses, it is detected less frequently, and usually mild infections occur. Thus, it does not present a public health importance. Okay. Whereas the influenza D viruses primarily affect the cattle and are not known to cause illness in people. And we were talking about these 2 glycoproteins, surface glycoproteins of the viruses, hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. And the variations in these 2 glycoproteins usually cause the variable intensity of the disease each year. Okay, there will be variations occurring on what? 2 glycoproteins, the hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. Okay, when minor changes occur in these glycoproteins in hemagglutinin, genetic drift is seen. Okay, minor changes cause genetic drift, whereas major changes, when there is a switch in hemagglutinin or neuraminidase, then genetic shift is seen. Okay, nomenclature is based on these glycoproteins. Okay, hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. Whenever there occurs a genetic shift, it results in circulation of new influenza strains. Previously, the exposed influenza strains to which the human population is exposed will be having a immunity. Let it be herd immunity or vaccinated immunity, will be having an immunity towards that strains. Whereas this new strains that is occurring due to genetic shift causes what? It causes influenza epidemic or pandemic, because there is no immunity for this new strain till now. And what will be the clinical features? What will be the clinical features? Generally, what are the clinical features you see in flu? Generally, the incubation period is 1 to 3 days. Okay, the normal incubation period is 1 to 3 days. And in uncomplicated disease, means there is nothing serious symptoms, no serious symptoms. Just the normal symptoms like fever, malaise, and cough can be seen. Whereas in viral pneumonia, it may occur, although pulmonary complications are most often due to super infection with Streptococcus pneumoniae, Staph aureus, or other bacteria. This meaning the pneumonia occurs where there is concurrent or coexisting super infection, because these infections cause immunosuppression or immunocompromised state. Super infection can collaborate with it, and viral pneumonia can occur. Extrapulmonary manifestations. We were talking about the general clinical features, which is fever, malaise, and cough, and we talked about viral pneumonia. Now we are talking about extrapulmonary. Other than the respiratory tract, we are talking about extrapulmonary manifestations, which is myositis, myocarditis can occur, pericarditis can occur, neurological complications can occur, Ray's syndrome in children can occur. Ray's syndrome is nothing but liver dysfunction will be there, elevated liver enzymes and liver LFT derangement will be there. Along with it, encephalitis can occur, and hepatic encephalopathy can occur. Transverse myelitis can occur. Okay, mortality increases. We were talking about it in the first slide. Okay, which group is high risk? The high risk is nothing but the extremes of age groups: elderly, and those with medical comorbidities. Medical comorbidities meaning any chronic illnesses like diabetes or hypertension or any other cardiovascular diseases. Okay, and in pregnant women and in children of less below 2 years. Okay, and how the diagnosis is made? The classic diagnosis is made by the viral antigen or RNA detection in the swabs taken from the nasopharyngeal samples. Okay, and rapid influenza diagnostic tests are present. These rapid influenza diagnostic tests, they give the result within 10 to 15 minutes, but they are not 100% sensitive or 100% accurate, okay, as other flu tests. Rapid molecular assays, these are another kind of rapid tests. They produce results within 15 to 20 minutes and are more accurate than rapid influenza diagnostic tests. Okay, and imaging to see whether there is any other pulmonary component, pulmonary changes, or any other changes that are present. We can see through the imaging, but diagnostic will be viral antigen or RNA detection in the nasopharyngeal samples. And how do you manage it? Symptomatic or supportive treatment is the mainstay. For fever, you'll be giving antipyretics. Okay, adequate fluid therapy, you will give antibiotics if there is any super infection is there. And the first line of management or the specific treatment is nothing but administration of neuraminidase inhibitors. We were talking about two glycoproteins, right? One is the hemagglutinin and the second one is neuraminidase. Okay, here we are giving administration of neuraminidase inhibitor. It is nothing but oral oseltamivir. You might have heard about it before. Oseltamivir 75 mg twice daily. Okay, or inhaled zanamivir 10 mg twice daily for 5 days. And this should be started within 48 hours of symptoms onset. Okay, note the point. This should be started within 48 hours of symptoms onset. Then it is best working. Okay, these agents have superseded routine use of amantadine and rimantadine. Amantadine and rimantadine were previously used, but now the strains that are coming, now the subtypes that are coming, the subtypes that are infecting the population mostly are resistant to these. So oseltamivir and zanamivir have took over amantadine and rimantadine in the treatment. And antiviral drugs can also be used as prophylaxis. Prophylaxis in which cases? In high-risk individuals during the flu season. Whenever the flu season starts, that time it can be, the antiviral agents can be taken as prophylaxis in the high-risk individuals. High-risk individuals are what? The elderlies, the infant group, and the healthcare professionals, and even the people with comorbid conditions like cardiovascular diseases or chronic illnesses like hypertension, diabetes, etc. Okay, and we talked about supportive therapy. Supportive therapy is nothing but IV fluids, antipyretics, and antibiotics where and when needed. Okay, and next, prevention. How do you prevent the influenza? Okay, it relies on seasonal vaccination of the elderly. The elderly are nothing but the risk group. Elderly, children 2 to 7 years of age, and individuals with chronic medical illnesses, as well as their healthcare workers. These are the risk group. So these risk group, every season, when the flu season starts, then you have to start seasonal vaccination. Okay, and this vaccination, it varies each year because there are developing new strains. It varies each year. So it is updated. The vaccination procedure is updated every year, and the updated vaccination should be taken just before the flu season in the high-risk individuals. Now, as I was talking, the vaccination composition changes each year to cover the predicted seasonal strains, but vaccination may fail when a pandemic or new strain emerges. Okay, when there is the genetic drift or shift and the new strain occurs, that time we don't have vaccination for that. So this vaccination may fail at that time when the pandemic is emerging. And in the out of the 4 types of influenza, type A, type B, type C, and type D, type A most commonly causes pandemic. Okay, and personal protective measures. We have talked about the management. We have talked about the prevention. Now, personal protective measures. How do you protect yourself from this? It is very important because as in the current case scenario where we are having now a COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, these guidelines can be followed even for the same that is happening now. Regular hand washing. Okay, with proper hand washing techniques. Regular hand washing. Good respiratory hygiene. Good respiratory hygiene is nothing but when you sneeze, when you cough or anything, you have to cover your mouth with a tissue paper or with your elbow, okay? And later on, dispose of the tissue paper in proper sanitary methods, okay? Early self-isolation of those feeling unwell. Those feeling unwell means not other ailments, those showing symptoms of fever or other symptoms of influenza, okay? Fever, malaise, cold or something like that. Avoid close contact with sick people. Unless until necessary, you avoid close contact with sick people. Avoid touching one's eyes, nose or mouth, okay? As our hands, commonly we touch everything. The inanimate objects can be affected and the hospital environment can be affected because there are different modes of spread. So due to avoid that spread from the inanimate objects or from the environment, surrounding environment or anything, you should avoid touching your eyes, nose or mouth without proper hand washing or proper hand sanitization. Okay, next topic. Next we'll talk about nosocomial infections. Just a second. Okay, next, this is an important topic, nosocomial infections. Infections. What is the definition of nosocomial infections? Infections that develop in patients after admission to the hospital, and this infection should neither be present or should not be in the incubation period at the time of hospitalization. Note the point, infection developing in patients after admission to the hospital, which was neither present or neither in the incubation period at the time of hospitalization. Okay, this is the criteria to call it or to consider it as a nosocomial infection. What are its synonyms? Hospital acquired infections, hospital associated infections, or hospital infections. These are the synonyms of nosocomial infections. Okay, and the symptoms or the signs may be evident during the patient stay or after the discharge. If they are infected, ఇందాక అది వచ్చిందండి. And where do these microbes come from? The infective causing agents, these microbes, where do they come from? It can be from the patient's own flora. There are healthy commensal bacteria inside the body of the patient. When the patient is immunocompromised or when there is any surgical procedure or anything that is taking place, patient's own flora can infect him. Okay, and cross infection from medical personnel, as a doctor doing the rounds will move from one patient to the other. And as we were talking earlier in influenza also, when inanimate objects or any other things or hospital environmental things which are contaminated with this get attached to the person and it is transmitted from bed to bed. So cross infection can occur by medical professional, okay, or medical personnel. And hospital environment, it can be in the air as droplet infection, it can be in the water, it can be in the dust, in the IV fluids or catheters, wash bowls, bedpans, endoscopes, ventilatory equipment, etc. Okay, the source of infection, we were talking about the microbes, okay, and the different places from where they can originate and from where they can infect. And we can classify it broadly into two types, endogenous and exogenous. Exogenous are from the hospital environment or from transmission from bed to bed or from patient to another patient or something like that. But endogenous, when you're coming from endogenous, it is nothing but it is present in the patient's own flora, and it might invade the patient tissue during some surgical operation or instrumental manipulation. Normal commensals of the skin, respiratory, GI, and urogenital tracts can then affect the patient. Whereas exogenous causes from another patient, staff member, environment of the hospital, and environmental sources of the hospital we talked about earlier, inanimate objects, air, water, food, cross infection from patient to patient or hospital patient to, and hospital staff to patient or patient to patient, okay? And microorganisms. Any pathogen on occasion can cause hospital acquired infection, okay? Those that are able to survive in the hospital environment and develop resistance to antibiotics and disinfectant are the major microbes that cause infections, okay? Because they are more virulent or more potent, and they are already resistant to the various antibiotics that we generally use in a day-to-day life. So their survival rate outside in the environment is high. So they are the major cause for infection. Commensal bacteria. Commensal bacteria, this is nothing but endogenous cause, okay? Because it is found in the patient's own flora. Found in the normal, and commensal bacteria is nothing but it is found in the normal flora of the healthy patient, and they significantly play a protective role, preventing colonization by pathogenic microorganisms. But some commensal bacteria, they can infect the host if their immunity is compromised, okay? Example, Staphylococcus epidermidis, okay? Causes of IV infections. When you put an IV catheter or something like that, then it can cause infections, okay? And E. coli, they generally cause UTIs, okay? When there is a Foley's catheter or something is placed and in place for a few days, and when the patient immunity is a bit low, that time these commensal bacteria can cause infections. And pathogenic bacteria, they have greater virulence and cause infections regardless of the host status. Means it causes infection regardless of your immunity levels, whether it is high or whether it is low. It doesn't come into account, okay? And a few examples of the bacteria: gram-positive bacteria, Staph aureus, the most commonly seen, Staphylococcus aureus bacteria. It colonizes in the skin, nose, and throat of generally the respiratory tract, okay, upper respiratory tract. They cause a wide variety of lung, bone, heart, bloodstream infections and are frequently resistant to all the normal antibiotics that we use, okay? And in hospital, commonly 40 to 50% of Staph aureus isolates are methicillin resistant Staph aureus, okay? And Staph epidermidis and group D streptococci. These are also a few examples of gram-positive bacteria. And coming to streptococci, Streptococcus hemolyticus and Streptococcus pyogenes. These are the other two gram-positive bacteria that can cause hospital-acquired infections, okay? And Clostridium tetani spores. As the Clostridium tetani spores survive in the dust for a very long time, they can easily cause hospital-acquired infections. Now coming to gram-negative bacteria. Once summarizing gram-positive bacteria, a few examples, a few common examples: Staph aureus, okay, and mostly the Staph aureus is multi-drug resistant, okay, and Staph epidermidis and group D streptococci. And streptococci examples: Streptococci hemolyticus and Streptococci pyogenes, okay, and Clostridium tetani spores. These are a few gram-positive bacteria. Gram-negative bacteria. Gram-negative bacteria examples: Enterobacteria and Pseudomonas species. Two types. Enterobacteria, again, the same thing. When the patient immunity level is compromised, okay, when the patient immunity level is low. So E. coli, Proteus, Klebsiella, Enterobacter, Serratia, these all can cause what? These all can cause infections, okay? And Pseudomonas species. Pseudomonas species often associated in the water and damp areas, okay? And they may colonize the digestive tract of the hospitalized patient. They're present in the water and damp areas. They colonize in the digestive tract of the hospitalized patient, and they have the ability to survive at very low temperatures. And they're resistant towards many antibiotics and disinfectants. So when you see in all this, commonly the classical features of the microbes that are causing hospital-acquired infections are the microbes which are resistant to temperatures and which can survive in extremes of temperatures, and which are multi-drug resistant. These kind of microbes are only colonizing and infecting. Okay. And viruses HIV, hepatitis B and C. How these viruses are acquired in the hospital? They can be transmitted to blood and blood products. Generally, it doesn't happen, but if you're not careful, if the screening is not done properly before the blood transfusion or something like that, or while doing a transfusion, while giving a injection, if the syringe is reused or contaminated, generally it should not be done like that. As soon as you use it for a single patient, it should be discarded. When you're giving a blood or blood products, the patient or as well as the donor should be screened beforehand itself. Okay, these are the measures that have to be taken to prevent these kind of spread. Cytomegalovirus, herpes virus, influenza virus, enteroviruses, arenaviruses, these all can cause hospital acquired infections. These are a few viruses that can be transmitted in the hospital. Whereas coming to the fungi, the examples are Candida albicans, Aspergillus and Mucor. And protozoal infections, Entamoeba histolytica, which is the most common, Plasmodia, Toxoplasma gondii and Pneumocystis carinii. And now coming to the modes of contact. Before we have seen different types of examples of different types of microbes: bacterial, viral, fungal, as well as protozoal. Okay, now coming to the modes of transmission. And the modes of transmission, the most common route of transmission is through contact. And this contact can be from hands or cloths. Hands or clothes means hands of staff, important vehicle of spread. Okay, and contacts of hands and clothing of attendants, the patient attendants. The patient will be bedridden or the patient will be staying on the bed, but the patient attendants will be roaming around. So if he catches any contaminated object or contaminated things and catches the or transmits it, it can be spread in that way. And hospital staff, as they are in the environment, in the hospital environment, and if the environment is contaminated, they can also spread it. Inanimate objects, improper disinfection of instruments, like the scopes that are used, bronchoscopes that are used, cystoscopes that are used, endoscopes that are used. If they are improperly disinfected, then it can be spread through these inanimate objects as well. Airborne, it is droplet infection, generally in the OPDs or something. When the patient comes with a problem and you ask him or you examine him, when you ask him to inhale or exhale or do such kind of things, when there is a cough or anything, it can aggravate. That time aerosol generation will happen. So this droplet infection can take place, as well as when the patient is in the admitted in the hospital in a bed or something. When he coughs or sneezes also, this droplet infection can occur. In order to prevent this, you have to give a mask and you have to explain about the proper techniques for the patient to prevent these kind of spread. Okay. And airborne, even in the dust, we were talking about a few microbes that can be staying in the dust, which are resistant to extremes of temperatures and resistant to multi-drugs. Okay. And aerosol generation techniques, these can also cause airborne infection spread. Aerosol generation techniques are nothing but when you take a swab or something, when gag reflex develops, then or the patient coughs or does something, when this procedure is done, then also droplet infection and aerosol generation can take place. Or when you're dusting something in the aerosol generation can take place. So this way aerosol spread also can take place. So we talked about contact spread. Contact spread is from hands and clothing and inanimate objects. And we talked also about airborne. Airborne is nothing but droplets, dust and aerosol spread. And oral route. Hospital food, if not properly taken care, may contain antibiotic resistant bacteria. And this bacteria, after ingestion through the form of food, can colonize in the intestine and can cause infections. And parental route. Next, coming to parental route. Number 4, parental route. Disposable syringes and needles. As we were talking, in order to prevent the transmission of, even when we were talking about the viruses, in the microbes, we were talking about the viruses. In the parental route, if you are reusing syringes or using instruments that are improperly sanitized or improperly sterilized, so it can be spreading. These microbes can be spreading with the usage of these kind of things. Certain infections may be transmitted even through blood transfusions, tissue donations, contaminated blood products. That is why screening is very important before you do such kind of major procedures. Common nosocomial infections. In UTI, the most common species, and UTI also when it is seen when there is catheterization or instrumentation of the urethra, bladder, and kidneys. In this ways, you are going into the genitourinary tracts. So at that time, the most common E. coli, Klebsiella, Proteus, Serratia, Pseudomonas. These are a few things which can cause urinary tract infections. Okay, and pneumonia. It is the leading cause of mortality in hospital-acquired infection. During aspiration in unconscious patients, pulmonary ventilation, such kind of patients also can develop pneumonia. Staph aureus, Klebsiella, Enterobacteria, Serratia, Proteus, these are all Pseudomonas. These are all few examples of pneumonia. So most common infections, first UTI, the second one is pneumonia. And wound and skin sepsis. Following after a surgical procedure is done, it is most commonly seen in patients who are a bit immunocompromised, like in the elderly or patient with diabetes or some. What will happen if you are not taking proper sterile measures? These wounds can get infected with the most common pathogens that are found in the hospital. Okay, so that is why sterile techniques are must and should. Gastrointestinal infections. Gastrointestinal infections, food poisoning due to salmonella or shigella. Okay, enterotoxic manifestation due to staphylococcal contamination of the cooked food. As we talked about, hospital microbes that are present in the hospital food, if you are not taking proper measures, these can go colonize in the GI tract and can cause infection in the patients. Okay, and diarrhea due to E. coli. Bacteremia and septicemia. If this bacteria invades your bloodstream in various hospital-acquired infections, they can cause bacteremia or septicemia. Most common gram-negative bacilli. Most commonly, they can cause bacteremia and septicemia. And tetany. When is tetanus caused? When inadequate attention to aseptic precautions during surgery, when the instruments and all are inadequately cleaned or inadequately sterilized, and contaminated dressings or improperly sterilized dressings, and improper disinfection of the site of the intramuscular injections, these all can cause tetanus. Okay, so once summarizing this, common nosocomial infections: UTIs, pneumonias, wound and skin infections, gastrointestinal infections, bacteremia, septicemia, and tetanus. And diagnosis. Coming to the diagnosis, diagnosis is done by routine bacteriological methods, means direct smear examination, culture, sensitivity testing. Okay, culture and sensitivity is to see whether the microbe is sensitive or resistant to the particular group of empirical therapy that we might have started for the infection. Okay, and identification and elimination require sampling from possible sources of infections, such as from the hospital personnel or inanimate objects that are surrounding the patient, or with what the patient and the patient have come in contact with, and air or food. Okay, types of isolates, okay, may indicate a causal connection. Prevention. What are the preventive measures in order to avoid all this? What are the preventive measures that you can take? The proper administration of antibiotic therapy to the carrier staff or source patient to destroy the pathogenic agents, and proper sterilization and disinfectant methods, okay, of inanimate objects, as well as proper disposal of all the infected material like the dressings, and proper sterilization of all the instruments when you're doing a procedure. Okay, disinfection of excreta and infected material. Okay, this is another point. Transmission can be controlled by regular washing of hands. So proper personal hygiene as well plays a major role in this, and using of sterile dressings and sterile environment before doing the dressings. So, like sterile dressings in the sense surgical gloves, properly autoclaved equipment, face masks for contributing in control of nosocomial infections, and preoperative disinfection of the patient skin in case of a surgical procedure, and proper investigation of hospital acquired infections and treatment of such cases. Okay, this is it. So, thank you. Chat box. Any questions? On the mainstay of treatment, this H5N1, it is again nothing but one of the question put up is the treatment of H5N1. Okay, it is nothing but one of the types. Okay, the one of the types when there is a change in the glycoprotein structure, the hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. Okay, when in this, the mainstay of treatment is nothing but supportive treatment. Okay, and the other thing is pre-flu seasonal vaccination, but the pre-seasonal vaccination cannot be 100% preventive or 100% effective, because whenever there is a change or whenever there is a shift or drift in the glycoprotein structure, then that time this vaccination cannot this thing. So the mainstay is giving supportive treatment, this antipyretics, adequate fluid therapy, and other drugs that can control your cold and cough. And the other thing is antiviral agents for 5 days. Oseltamivir for 75 mg BD for 5 days, or zanamivir 10 mg given in aerosol way for 5 days. Okay. If the treatment has not started within the first 48 hours, the reaction, that means the patient reaction towards the treatment can be not so good. Okay, and that too, this occurs in people who are immunocompromised, like the elderly group and the extremes of age groups, meaning the extremes of age groups, and patients having hypertension, diabetes. And previously there was a question put that the mainstay of treatment for the infection, the mainstay of the treatment for infection is parallelly the comorbid conditions also should be well controlled, means diabetes should be under strict control, hypertension should be under strict control, and whether there are any other comorbidities, such conditions also should be addressed, so that this whatever supportive treatment that we are giving will be effective. And if the most positive outcomes will come if it is started within the first 48 hours. That doesn't mean the treatment will be a failure if it is started after 48 hours, but early recognition is quite uncommon, because generally these flu symptoms are common. Influenza flu symptoms are commonly the flu symptoms of almost many viruses that most commonly cause our upper respiratory tract infections. So the treatment is empirical treatment only in the beginning, and in the first 48 hours it is very difficult. The patient itself will directly not realize that this can be influenza infection or something like that. So even if it is started after 48 hours, if all the supportive measures are followed strictly and the patient other comorbid conditions are addressed perfectly, the outcome will be good, unless until extreme immunocompromised conditions and extremes of age groups are present. The most common causes in the microbes, we have talked about a few examples. In each system it varies. Commonly we see staph aureus and staph and streptococcal infections. Most commonly we see these are the microbes that are resistant to the hospital environment. Okay, namely they are resistant to antibiotics. Okay, most of the antibiotics that are commonly used in day-to-day life, those antibiotics they are resistant to, and they can stay in the extreme of climatic conditions, and some few stay in the dust for many days. These pathogens most commonly cause hospital acquired infections. Okay, close.